The lecture addresses the problem of how we understand speakers to mean things they don't actually say. Communication is not merely a matter of a speaker encoding a thought and sending it to a receiver, who is then to decode the message. In fact, the receiver does not only decode the words uttered, the meaning expressed by the words uttered, but has to draw an inference as to what is conveyed but what is stated. So we have introduced a distinction between the sentence meaning and the speaker's meaning, or in other words, this is a distinction between natural meaning and non-natural meaning, or still using some different words for that, it is a distinction between the explicit meaning, that is what is said, and the implicit meaning, that is what is implicated. The distinction into natural meaning and non-natural meaning was introduced by the linguistic philosopher Paul Grices. So natural meaning is a meaning that is present on every occasion when an expression occurs. In other words, it is the inherent meaning of a lexical item, it is conventional, and it constitutes an entailment, that is, a logical consequence of the encoded form. Non-natural meaning is changeable, it is context sensitive, and it is not always associated with the sentence from which it may be inferred. Thus, it is not part of the entailment. It gives rise to a non-conventional meaning called implicature. If you look at the examples below, you can easily notice the difference between natural meaning and non-natural meaning. Did you enjoy the evening at Bob and Sue's? I'm not much of a party person. So if you consider B's utterance, I'm not much of a party person, certainly you understand it literally, and this is what speaker B wanted to communicate. But in addition to that, he wanted to communicate that he did not enjoy the evening at Bob and Sue's. So what is not part of the proposition, I'm not much of a party person, is the implicated meaning called implicature. Here, as you can see, the encoded meaning is part of the message. But in the next example, which represents irony, the encoded meaning is not a part of the conveyed message. So if we all know Joan, and we know that she has no sense of direction whatsoever, then the sentence, with her excellent spatial sense, Joan is sure to find the shortcut and be the first to arrive, represents irony. So here, as you can see, we say something completely different than we mean. Paul Grices argues that speakers intend to be cooperative when they talk, which means that they are quite willing to provide a sufficient amount of information in a perspicuous manner, and that this information that provided is relevant to the context. So he actually, Paul Grices formulates the cooperative principle. Make a conversational contribution such as is required at the stage at which it occurs by the accepted purpose or direction of the talk exchange. So the cooperative principle can be viewed as consisting of several maxims, and they are collectively known as the clarity principles, because if speakers abide by these maxims, the result of the exchange is a highly efficient exchange of information. So these maxims are the maxim of quantity, the maxim of quality, the maxim of relation, sometimes called the maxim of relevance, and the maxim of manner. The maxim of quantity obliges the interlocutors to say just enough, not too much, not too little. the maxim of quality obliges them to tell the truth. This is not the truth, the absolute truth, but this is rather sincerity. So they shouldn't mislead the addressee, they shouldn't deceive the addressee intentionally. So as long as they believe that what they convey is true, is reliable, they are telling the truth. The maxim of relation assumes that speakers are relevant, so that they speak to the point, that they do not unnecessarily change the topic. They do not divert from the main course of conversation for unnecessary reasons. The maxim of manner obliges the speakers to be perspicuous, which means that they should relate events in an orderly and clear way. Implicatures arise in two different ways. So first of all, the speakers may abide by the maxims. And if they do, what arises is a context-independent generalized implicature. On the other hand, if they flout the maxims, that is, if they exploit them, what arises is a context-sensitive, particularized implicature. So let's go back to observing maxims. Let's imagine the following conversation. Did you invite Tom and Sue to the party? I invited Tom. So the maxim that arises, the implicature that arises is that I did not invite the other person. And this implicature arises because the speaker abides by the maxim of quantity. He simply or she simply says enough. Okay? So you do not need to know any particular context to derive this implicature. It is evident. In the case of flouting maxims, you need access to the context to derive the implicature. We'll discuss some examples of particularized implicatures in a minute, but let's just concentrate on flouts on quantity, quality and manners and refer to certain devices of figurative language that represent them. So for instance, tautology like war is war or life is life is a typical quantitative flout because you repeat something unnecessarily. This is superfluous, okay? So from the point of view of the propositional content, nothing new is introduced. Nevertheless, obviously, there is some additional meaning in life is life and war is war. If you say life is life, you just want to convey that you shouldn't perhaps complain too much because this is what is to be expected. And the same concerns tautology, war is war. Atrocity, this is what you may expect. Okay? Now, in the case of quality flouts, so here, as you can see, metaphors can represent quality flouts because you're not telling what you believe to be true. If you say that someone is made of iron, or that someone is a block of ice, you do not mean it really. Irony, that is saying something that is completely the opposite of what you really mean. Or rhetorical question. Rhetorical question is simply not a sincere question. The same kind of reasoning applies to understatements and overstatements. You're not being sincere. So all of them are classified as quality flouts. Let us discuss some examples. So if you look at the first one, did you buy bread and cheese? I bought bread, so this is similar to the one that we have already presented. Obviously, I bought bread means I did not buy cheese. And the implicature arises because we abide by the quantity maxim. If you look at the next one, well, it's a university uttered by a university teacher to a student who is not prepared to the class. Then you can interpret it as a flout on quantity. So the implicature arises as a result of the exploitation of the quantity maxim, because he says, I mean, the teacher says something that is obvious. It is a university and everybody knows that. What the teacher means is probably that this is what is expected at the university, that you will be prepared, that this is a kind of childish, a sort of childish justification that you provide. But from the point of view of the propositional content that is conveyed, obviously it is a trivial truth. So this is stating the obvious. So it is a flout on quantity. Now the next one, Mary is arranging Inferno, a metaphorical expression. So obviously we do not mean what we say literary. If we do not mean what we say literary, then it is a flout on quality. So this implicature, you can imagine Mary in that state of mind. This implicature is due to the flout on quality. The next one, also available in white, which is a comment scratched in the dirt of a white car, is a flout on quality too, because it is insincere. We know that it is, the car is white, but still provide a sentence like that. Obviously it functions as perhaps an ironical criticism. The next one, do you really have to spill your wine all over my carpet? Again, a rhetorical question in a way, very critical and not sincere. So it is a flout on quality. The next one, it was a case of being economical with the truth, is an understatement for saying that, for stating that something was simply a lie. So again, we are not being quite sincere. Now, the next two, ahead of current thinking and acts on the spot, which are both advertisements, the first one of the national power and the second for acne preparation, represent manner flouts because, as you can see, the word current in the first one and the word. We have distinguished between generalized implicatures and particularized implicatures. So particularized implicatures are context dependent and the meaning changes when the context changes. Some of these cannot arise if we have no access to the context. Generalized implicatures, on the other hand, are context insensitive. That is, they always arise, and even if we do not have any access to the context, we can still derive that kind of implicature. Now, scalar implicatures represent generalized implicatures. So again, they are context independent. Certain information is always communicated by selecting a word which expresses one value from a scale of values. And below, there are examples of certain scales. So the first will be the scale of quantity, then of frequency, then of probability, obligation, then some other scales, and at the end of that page you can notice such scales as love, like, or perhaps sweltering, hot, warm, cool, cold. So these are context-specific scales. And the idea is that actually almost all lexical items can be arranged according to a certain scale, along a certain scale. So the choice of one particular item on a scale gives rise to the implicature that all the items above the chosen one do not apply. So if I say that something happens often, I imply that it does not happen always. If I say that some people believe in God, I imply that not all of them do. If I say that something is possible, then I want to say that it is not certain. If I say that I may do it, I suggest that I do not have to do it. Then if I say that I saw a child in the garden, then the child I saw is certainly not my child. And if I use or, then I imply that not both items are involved. Mind you that all the above implicatures arise because I abide by the maxim of quantity. That is, I say enough. If I had meant something more, then I would have. The claim is that the maxims of conversation, that is, the clarity principles, are not artifacts, that is, artificially devised by a linguist. So the claim is that they do exist. In fact, speakers who know nothing of pragmatics whatsoever show their awareness of the existence of such norms as quantity, quality, relation and manner, because from time to time they make comments on their own performance. So these comments are called metalinguistic reflexes or metalinguistic glosses. For instance, if they say, all I know is smoking damages your health instead of smoking damages your health, they somehow limit the strength of the proposition that follows, that is, smoking damages your health. If they say smoking damages your health, again, they signal that this is not their personal opinion, or that this is just based on some generally shared knowledge. And if they say smoking damages your health for sure, they strengthen somehow the proposition. Or if they say, I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear, they signal that they know they should be clear, but for one reason or another, they perhaps cannot accomplish that. So such metalinguistic comments on our own performance as speakers are called hedges. And hedges can be basically of two types. So they can mitigate the strength of the proposition that follows, or they may somehow intensify the strength of the proposition that follows. So if they mitigate, they are called downtoners or downgraders or mitigators. If they intensify, they are called intensifiers or boosters. Collectively, they are just called hedges. So hedges signal that we are aware of what is expected of us. We may hedge quality, quantity, manner and relation. So if I say all I know is smoking damages your health, this is a hedge on quantity. If I say they say smoking damages your health, this is a hedge on quality. So I simply somehow restrict my commitment to the truth of the following proposition. In the first one, I somehow restrict my own knowledge as to whether smoking damages your health or not. If I say smoking damages your health and that's all there is to it, this is an intensifier on quantity. If I say smoking damages your health for sure, this is an intensifier on quality. If I say, by the way, I signal that what I'm going to say is not strictly to the point, so it is a hedge on relation. If I say the point is smoking damages your health, it is an intensifier on relation. If I say, if you see what I mean, or I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear, so these are hedges on manner. Here, as you can see, are some further examples of hedges. To the best of my recollections, and there is some evidence to the effect that, are hedges on quantity. I think, I believe, I assume, are hedges on quality. I simply restrict my commitment to the truth of the proposition that follows. With complete honesty, I can say, and I absolutely deny, on the other hand, are boosters, are intensifiers on quality. As you probably know, and as is well known, are again hedges on quantity, because what follows is something that may be already known to the audience. to cut a long story short, and I won't bore you with details, will be a Hajj on manner. I don't know if this is important, or this may not be relevant, or sorry for the digression. Are all Hajjs on relevance? I'm not sure if this makes sense. This may be a bit confusing. Are all Hajjs on manner? The important point about the maxim Hajjs is that none of them adds truth value to the utterances, to the embedded utterances. So the embedded utterances are true under the same circumstances as are the sentences without Hajjs at the very beginning. So they are not part, Hajjs are not part of the propositional content. So they are comments. This is just, this evidences that they are metalinguistic comments on our performance rather than the propositional content that we want to communicate. If you look at the last line, hopefully, regrettably, happily, and unfortunately, these can function as sentence adverbs, and they represent our involvement in a way. They signal our involvement, so our attitude to the proposition expressed. And obviously they do not add truth value to the utterances they modify, so they are similar to Hajjs. So some pragmaticians treat them as Hajjs as well, but obviously we cannot say that they Hajj either quality or quantity or manner or relation. And just to illustrate the problem of Hajjs in English in particular, could you please have a look at the following fragment? Well, Minister, if you ask me for a straight answer, then I shall say that as far as we can see, looking at it by and large and taking one time with another in terms of the averages of departments, then in the final analysis it is probably true to say that at the end of the day, in general terms, you would probably find that, not to put too fine a point in it, there probably wasn't very much on it, one way or the other, as far as one can see at this stage. So it will be extremely difficult for you, I believe, to identify those parts of the utterance. In addition to conversational implicature, Grice describes conventional implicature. So conventional implicature differs from conversational implicature because it is always there. It is attached to a particular lexical item. So whenever a word occurs, it carries across conventional implicature. And here are some examples of words that usually convey the conventional implicature. So this is actually, but, even, and still. So the literal meaning of actually is in reality, but the implied meaning will be though it is hard to credit. The literal meaning of but is the same as the literal meaning of and, so it is simply a logical conjunction. But the implied meaning of but is contrast. So if I say John likes tomatoes and Tom likes cucumbers, there seems to be no contrast between these two. But if I say John likes tomatoes but Tom likes cucumbers, but seems to imply that there is some contrast between these two. If we use even, literally it means in addition to, but the implied meaning of that is not expected. So if I say even John was moved, so it means that John was moved, but in addition it means that we did not expect that of John. And the same applies to still. So if I say, the literal meaning of still is in the continuing present, but implied is in spite of what has been said before. I know I'm guilty, Still, you should be more comprehensive. So this seems to be the final picture of what is conveyed. So what is conveyed typically consists of what is said and what is implicated. What is implicated can be implicated conventionally and conversationally. What is implicated conversationally can be a generalized, context-independent implicature or particularized, context-sensitive implicature. Now, generalized implicature and particularized implicature constitute non-natural meaning. What is said or conventionally implicate constitutes. Could you please have a look at the example? Even political hogs need a hug from time to time. So let us analyze the sentence in terms of types of meaning. The first one, entailment. Strong-handed politicians are occasionally in need of affection too. Conventional implicature, which is triggered by the word even, gives us unexpectedly, strong-handed politicians are occasionally in need of affection too. Generalized conversational implicature, which arises from our compliance with the quantity maxim, and mainly it is the word occasionally, which is an item on a scale, so we can recognize here a scalar implicature, gives us, it is not always or even often that strong-handed politicians need a hug. And a particularized conversational implicature may be just anything that comes to your mind, depending on the context, so there are numerous options. Now perhaps we can discuss the properties of conversational implicatures. So the first property is calculability, and it simply means that if we all have access to the same context, we are all capable of deriving the same implicature following a particular comprehension procedure. We simply start with the literal meaning of an utterance, and if we are not satisfied with its face value, then we look for a different alternative interpretation. Step by step, we check the interpretive hypotheses. So this is what is meant by calculability. It is not decoding. It is not that we all share a secret code. For instance, we may assume that there is a certain code, like when playing bridge, for instance, and I want to signal that my cards are pretty good, then I say my aunt lives in Vladivostok. And then if you know the code, then you can obviously get the meaning. But with implicatures, you do not need to know any code. If you know the context, then you can calculate this conversational implicature. Deniability, which can be suspendability or cancelability, you can either suspend the implicature or cancel it altogether, is again another feature of a conversational implicature. So you may say, I've won $5, and the implicature of that is based on quantity, that is that you haven't won more than 5. But after a while you may add, in fact, you've won 10. You've won $5. In fact, you've won 10. So the second utterance somehow cancels the implicature derived from the first utterance. Non-detachability. Non-detachability stems from the fact that implicatures are attached to utterances, not to sentences, that is, not to linguistic forms. In other words, whatever you say, the same implicature arises in the same context. So for instance, if we all know that John is imbecile, then whether I say John is a genius, or whether I say John is not particularly bright, or whether I say John is not very intelligent, or if I say John is intelligent, the same implicature arises, because what is actually responsible for the implicature is a combination of the words uttered and the context, rather than just the lexical item itself. And finally, reinforceability. You may reinforce the implicature. So you may say, some of them came, but not all. So as you know, some pragmaticians believe that the distinction into two levels of understanding, that is said and implicated, is not enough, is not precise enough. So they believe that perhaps we should discriminate a little more neatly, and therefore they introduce three levels of meaning. So the first one will be context-independent quantity inferences, and they are instances of utterance type meaning. And then context-dependent particularized inferences that are instances of utterance token meaning. So in addition to the level of said. So first we've got the level of said, words uttered, then the level of utterance type, and then the level of utterance token. It gives us three levels of meaning. So utterance type inferences are based on the maximum of quantity, but on the second part, so to say, of the maximum of quantity. You can view the maximum of quantity as consisting of two independent instructions. So the first one is make a contribution as informative as is required, and the second one is do not make a contribution more informative than is required, which means say as little as you possibly can and get away with it. So if you can say I don't drink, and the addressee will understand that it means alcohol, if it is in a way presupposed, then you do not have to say I don't drink alcohol. So we may say that I don't drink represents an utterance type implicature, a predictable type of utterance with a regular interpretation across a range of contexts. And the same probably applies to pali pan in Polish. So we usually associate it, its default meaning will be to smoke cigarettes. But you can also imagine a situation in which sąsiedzie pali pan, that kind of question, is addressed perhaps at the beginning of October to your neighbor, who is the owner of a detached or semi-detached house, and then it may mean that you simply switch on your central heating, okay? And obviously this is not a default interpretation of the utterance, so it is an utterance token, a single instance of an utterance whose interpretation is context-specific. We can also imagine the situation in which I don't drink will in fact imply I don't drink milk in the appropriate context. So this is the differentiation into three types of meaning. And we may say that perhaps an utterance type is a shortcut to. Thank you for your attention.